Hey Chevra, what's going on? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we are studying Daf Kuf Beis, Daf 102 of Masechta Ayruvin. Chevra, we're getting very close to being Messiah Be'ezer Hashem. Masechta Ayruvin in just a few days. Today's talking an interesting daf. Some stuff that there are going to be some throwbacks to Masechta Shabbos. A few different Mishnayos. We talk about bolts and doors. You take a bolt, you stick it into the threshold of a door, and now you can't open it. Can you put them into place on Shabbos or not? Maybe it depends if they have a knob or no knob. Okay, very nice. Refastening doors. There's going to be nafkaminas between if you're doing it in the Beis HaMikdash, outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Applying bandages on Shabbos. Reapplying bandages, applying for the first time bandages that fell off, all sorts of interesting inyonim in relation to bandages. Chevra, let's get started. Kuf Aleph Mud Beis at the Mishnah, 5 lines from the bottom. Neger shehaya birosho glustera. So if you have this bolt of a door, and at the top of the bolt there is a knob, which basically makes it like a mortar, something that you'll use to like crush spices and stuff. So Rabbi Eliezer Oser, Rabbi Yossi Matir. So Rabbi Eliezer says that you would be unable to use this bolt on Shabbos. Rabbi Yossi says you're permitted, and the Gemara is going to explain under what circumstances are they talking about. Rabbi Eliezer Ma'aseh B'Knesset ShebeTveria says Rabbi Eliezer that there's a story with some kind of gathering, I guess, in Tveria, that Shayunei Hagim Bo Heter, that they assumed that you were allowed to use these bolts that had knobs on them. Ad sheba Rabbi Gamliel v'azkenim v'asulayin, until Rabbi Gamliel and the Zakenim came and said that you're not allowed to do this. So Rabbi Eliezer is using this as a proof to say that you're not allowed to use these bolts with knobs on them. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Isenu agubo uva Rabbi Gamliel v'azkenim v'etiruloyin. Rabbi Yossi says it was taka the opposite, that they were saying that you're not allowed to use these bolts, and came Rabbi Gamliel and say taka are allowed to use these bolts that have knobs on them. Interestingly, there's a girsa change in the Mishnah from Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Elazar. What do you guys think? Do you think it should be Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Elazar? So I can kind of like hear it both ways, because on the one hand, it's machlokas, right, is bar plugta is Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi were contemporaries, so it makes sense to say this machlokas between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi. Often we see, along with Rabbi Eliezer, would be like Rabbi Yoshua, maybe Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Yossi would make sense from that standpoint to be arguing with Rabbi Elazar. But on the other hand, Lamaise, our Girsa says Rabbi Eliezer, and we saw this machlokas, we're going to see in the Gemara that really this machlokas has to do with if this bolt is held by a rope and dangling, which was really machlokas that we saw in Masechta Shabbos in the context of like those window shutters, which was a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. So maybe Taka does make sense to Rabbi Eliezer. Chevra, what do you think? Says the Gemara, Benita be'ogdo kuliyamalo pligi deshari, that if we're talking about a bolt that is attached to the door or even the door frame, and it is attached with a rope, and this rope is strong enough that you could pick up the bolt from the rope, that you could just pull the rope and it'll stay, the rope won't break, it'll be strong enough to lift up the bolt. Well, then everyone agrees that that is fine. You would be allowed to use this bolt to keep the door shut, and it would just be considered, it wouldn't be bone, right? It wouldn't be considered building that, so it would be fine. Ki plige, this machlokas between, let's say, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi is b'she'enu nita be'igado. It's where, sure, it's connected with a rope, but the rope is pretty weak, and if you try picking up this bolt using the rope that's attaching it, that's attached to it, the rope will break. So in that case, that's where we have machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi. The Ma'asaver came into yesh brosho glustra toras kli alav, Ma'asaver came into eno nita be'igado lo. So, Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that since at the top there is this knob, which makes it essentially like a mortar, so therefore it's a kli, and since it's a kli, you can use it. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says that it would be also to use this bolt because since it is not since it is attached with a rope that is weak, that is unable to pick it up, so therefore it's considered detached. And as we're going to learn in the next Mishnah, that a rope that is detached, a bolt that is detached from the door is going to be a problem. You're not going to be able to use it. Well, now with that segue, new Mishnah, Neger anigrar ne'alim bo b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So if you have a bolt that is dragging on the floor, it's connected to some kind of a rope or a string, and it's dragging on the floor, and I assume it's talking about where, I have to assume that it's talking about where it is the rope is too weak, that if you lift up the bolt by it, then it would be unable to support the bolt, because if it could support the bolt, we just said everyone would agree that you'd be able to use the bolt. So Mistama, it's talking about where the rope is not strong enough. And the Gemara is also going to say that in a few minutes from now, so I have to assume that that's what we're talking about. So Neger and Nigrar, so if you have a bolt that is attached to the door by a rope, and so No'alin bo b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So in the Beis HaMikdash, you would be allowed to nonetheless use this bolt to close the to close doors. Avalo b'medina, but you'd be unable to use this bolt outside of the Beis HaMikdash, right? Because it would be also midrabanan. Now, of course, we know in Shvus b'mikdash that these isurim dirabanan, if they interfere with avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, then we don't worry about these isurim dirabanan, and we do the avodah that we need to do. So therefore, since ein Shvus b'mikdash, so you'd be allowed to use these bolts in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. V'amunach kan v'kan aser. But if the bolt is not attached whatsoever to the door, it's just free, so then even even in the Beis HaMikdash, you'd be unable to use it, because it would just be considered, if you use it, it'll be like boneh. It'll be like you're adding to the, you're constructing something in the building. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, hamunach muter b'mikdash v'hanigrar b'medina. So Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that actually, so let's reverse it. So actually, the bolt that is tied to the door frame, so that's actually completely mutter. So even in the Medina, it's mutter. So whereas the Tanna Kama says that would only be allowed in the Beis HaMikdash, but outside of the Beis HaMikdash would not be allowed. But Rabbi Yehuda says that this bolt that is attached to the door or the door frame by a rope is actually 100% mutter even outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and if it is not attached at all, so that's where it's also midrabanan. So outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you'd be unable to use it, but in the Beis HaMikdash, you would be able to use it. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Eizuhu neger hanigrar shene'alin b'mikdash. What is this bolt that is dragging on the floor that you are allowed to use it in the Beis HaMikdash, avalo b'medina, but not outside the Beis HaMikdash? Kol shekashur v'talui. Well, it's talking about a bolt that is tied and dangling, v'rosho echad magia la'aretz, and it reaches the ground, so it's lying on the ground. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, avze b'medina muter. This case, when you have this bolt that's dangling and lying on the ground, so that would be allowed even, well, I guess technically it wouldn't be dangling if it's lying on the ground, but if it's attached by a rope and lying on the ground, that would even be permitted outside of the Beis HaMikdash. What is the case of this bolt that you can use in the Beis HaMikdash but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash? Kol she'eino lo kasher v'lo talui. That would be a bolt that is neither tied nor dangling, i.e. it's completely free, and you could remove it from the threshold and just put it in the corner. That would be allowed in the Beis HaMikdash because it would be also midrabanan, but outside, meaning because it's also midrabanan, so in the Beis HaMikdash it's allowed, outside of the Beis HaMikdash it would not be allowed. Amr of Yehuda, Amr Shmuel, says Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, halachik Rabbi Yehuda benigrar, that the halach is like Rabbi Yehuda benigrar, when the bolt is attached by way of a rope and on the ground, i.e. that it would be 100% permitted, like Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rava, v'hu shekasur b'delis. But Rava says, but in order for this to be true, that it's 100% mutter, it would have to be tied to the door. It can't be tied to the door frame. It would have to be tied to the door itself. Then it would be clear that this bolt is connected to the door, and not, it wouldn't be considered bone. It would be considered already part of the door and used for locking it. Ini, is this really the case? But wait a second. Reb Tavla visited to Mechoza, and he saw that there was a certain fellow that had a bolt that was tied to the door frame, i.e. not to the door, it was tied to the door frame. And Reb Tavla didn't say anything. So it sounds like what Rava is claiming. Oh, and interestingly also Rava is saying Rava was from Mechoza, right? Rava was saying that the bolt would have to be tied to the door specifically. But Reb Tavla visited Mechoza, and Itaka saw someone who had a bolt that was tied to the door frame and not to the door. So like, what's going on? So Ahu Nito Bi'igado Hava. The Gemara answers, oh, that guy. So that he had a bolt that was tied to the door frame, but with a sturdy rope. And as we learned earlier, if it's got a sturdy rope, well then it's no problem. Then it's clear that this bolt is part of the door mechanism, and it would be permitted to use it. Rav Avya ikla l'naharda'a. Rav Avya visit Naharda'a chazilahu gavra dehava katir begemi. So Rav Avya saw that there was a certain fellow who was tying a bolt to a door with like a reed, not something particularly strong. Amr dain lo nitrok, to which Rav Avya said, okay, this you would be unable to lock with on Shabbos because it's not a strong rope. Okay. And as Rashi says, because here it's as if the reed doesn't exist bichlal because it's so weak. Okay. Okay, so what if you have a bolt and the bolt goes into the threshold, but it mamish goes all the way through the threshold into the ground? So Amr of Yosef, so if Yosef says, "My tibayle," what is Reb Zera asking? Lo shmiele haditanya. Didn't he hear the following brisa? Classic Rav Yosef, right? Rav Yosef with his encyclopedic memory. Like, what's Rav Zera asking? What, he doesn't know the brisa? Everybody knows the brisa. Nishmat aser, nikmaz mutter. That if you have a bolt that is completely detached, well then that's going to be forbidden. But if it's nikmaz, that's going to be forbidden. But if it's nikmaz, if it is just kind of driven through the threshold, so that would be permitted. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, and says Rabbi Yehuda, nikmaz afal pi she'eino nishmat aser. That if you have a situation where the bolt goes through the threshold into the ground, even though it is not detached, meaning even though it's still attached, nonetheless it will be forbidden. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and I think it's Rav Yosef continuing, because Rav Yosef, of course, was a student of Rav Yehuda, who was a student of Shmuel, and as we've seen a number of times, right, Rav Yosef would sometimes say to Abai, it can't be that if Shmuel would have said this, I would not know it, right? Meaning, so therefore, I think this is still Rav Yosef saying that we have this machlokes between the Chachamim and Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says it's aser, and my Rebbe Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel that the halacha is like Rav Yehuda, that it's aser. That halacha Rav Yehuda benikmaz when the bolt goes through the threshold into the ground. V'taima mai, how come? Because it looks like building, like constructing on Shabbos. Okay, fine. So it looks like, to answer Reb Zera's question about if you have a bolt that goes through the threshold into the ground, would it be permitted? Chevra, what's the answer? Sounds like the answer is no, it wouldn't be permitted, because we would paskin like Reb Yehuda, who says that it's also because it's mechse kibona. Chevra, let's go weiter. Ba'amine Rav Nachumi bar Zechariah me Abaye. Rav Nachumi bar Zechariah asked Abaye, Asolo Beisyad Mau, what if the bolt has a knob on it? Amrle Buchna Kamart. He says, oh, well, that's just a mortar. Pestle. I was saying mortar, I think, before, about like the kli with the, right, the bolt with the knob. No, it's not a mortar, it would be a pestle. Pestle is a thing you knock with. The mortar is a thing that you knock in. Okay. So Abai says, okay, basically you're asking about a pestle, which would be permitted. It sounds like Rabbi Yossi, who said that with the pestle earlier, with the bolt, with the knob on it, it's permitted because it's a kli. Itmanami was also stated, Amr of Nachumi bar Ada, Aslo Beis Yad Mutter, that if you make a knob on the bolt, then it essentially becomes a pestle and it would be permitted. How Sharisa, there was a certain beam, Dava Be Rabbi Pidas, that was by Rabbi Pidas's house. Dava Midalu la Be Asara Vishadula Adasha, that it would take 10 people to lift up this beam, then they would put it by the door to keep the door closed. V'lo Amalu v'lo Midi, and he didn't say anything to them, meaning it was all good. Amar Torah's Kli Ale says, look, it's got a Torah's Kli on it because you could theoretically sit on this beam. Hai Asisa Davos Be Mashmuel, there was a certain mortar, not a pestle, but a mortar, Dahavas Be Mashmuel, that was by the house of Shmuel. Dahava Machzekes Adriva, and this mortar was able to hold an Adriva. An Adriva is half of a core, i.e., that is 15 sa'ah. Apparently it's between 30 and 60 gallons, so it could hold quite a bit of contents. Shara Mar Shmuel Mishadi Adasha, and he allowed them to put that on the threshold to keep the door closed. Amatoras Kli Ale says, well, because it has the status of a vessel. Shalach le Rami bar Yechezkel, Rav Amram. Rami bar Yechezkel, he sent a letter to Rav Amram, and in the letter he asked, Nema, or I don't know if he sent a letter, maybe he sent a person, but he sent to Rav Amram and he asked, Nema lon mar mehalin mile me'al yisa tomad lon mishmed Rav Asi. He says, hey Rav Amram, can you tell us from some of these beautiful things that you said in the name of Rav Asi, bechife de arva, when it comes to the sugya of these bows of a boat. Ki'ilu, you have a boat, imagine epis like a canoe, but maybe just think of like a bigger canoe, and from like one side of the canoe to the other side, not lengthwise but widthwise, there were like these bows, like these wood things that like half circle things, like the things at the weddings that I think like at the weddings I've been to, I think more like in America, the girls, they like hold these like things when like the bride and groom walk into the dancing part and then like they run through it. So imagine like you have all these girls like on the boat holding these like arches, that's the word. These arches like from side to side, but minus the girls, just the arches. So a boat with that. So apparently Rav Amram had some good opinions regarding these arches. So Shalach le Hachi Amar Rav Asi. So Rav Amram said, well, this is what Rav Asi said. Hanikife de arva, so these arches of the boat, bisman sheish boen tefach, so if they have a thickness of a tefach on these arches, inami ein boen tefach, or maybe they don't have a thickness of a tefach, ve'ein ben zelazeh shlosha, but between each arch there are less than 3 tefachim. So, meaning, if the arches were a tefach thick, or they weren't a tefach thick, but they were less than 3 tefachim between them, i.e., so you could say lavud in that they're all connected, so then maybe machzeles ufaris alein, so you could take some kind of a covering and spread it over these arches. My time hakam mosif al oil araihu v'shapir dami, because you are simply adding to a temporary structure, and therefore it is acceptable. You're not building a structure, you're just adding to a structure. Hanu dachre. There were rams that Rav Huna owned, that during the day they required shade, but during the night they required air, i.e., during the day when they required shade, he'd have to put up some shade for them to cover them, and at night he would have to remove the shade. So the question is, how do you deal with that on Shabbos? So Rav Huna came before his Rebbe Rav, and Rav said to him, Zil kroch budya v'shayir ba tefach. So what you should do is before Shabbos, wrap up this covering of the, meaning because at night he would remove the covering so that there would be air for the sheep, the rams. So Rav suggested that he roll up the covering before Shabbos begins, but leave a tefach still covering wherever the rams were. L'machar pashta mosif alol arayu v'shapir dami. Then tomorrow what you could do is just unroll the mat or the covering, and that would be acceptable because you're just adding on to what was already a temporary dwelling, a temporary ohel. Amr Rav Mishum Rebchia Vilon Mutul Toso Mutul Farko b'Shabbos. Interesting. So a curtain, you're allowed to put it up and take it down on Shabbos. So let's say between two rooms you have a curtain, so you'd be able to take up and down the curtain because it's clearly arai. It's meant to come up and down. It's temporary. Kilas chasanim. So if you have like a bed that we've seen this before in Masechta Shabbos. If you have a bed and it has like a covering for it, but not like a blanket. Like Kilu, imagine you have a bed and at the front, by the foot of the bed, there's like a pole going up, and by the head of the bed, there's a pole going up, and then there's a pole going from pole to pole horizontally. So, and then you take some kind of covering and you drape it over. So that's a kilas chasanim. So mutter leforkav and tosa b'Shabbos, you're allowed to put up the covering and take down the covering on Shabbos. You don't have to worry about constructing an ohel. Amar of Sheish as breder of Idi la'amarin ela she'en begaga tefach. That is only if that beam going from the foot to the head has less than a tefach of width. Aval yesh begaga tefach aser. But if the top of it has a width of a tefach, well then it won't be allowed, because then you're constructing a roof of a tefach. That would be considered an ohel, and that would be considered not allowed to be done on Shabbos. She'en begaga tefach. And even if the top beam doesn't have a thickness of a tefach, lo amaron ela she'en bepachus mishlosha samuch legag tefach. Now still, within 3 tefachim of the top, so i.e. within the 3, I don't know how to say that any differently, but as you get close to the top, so once you hit within 3 tefachim, i.e. lavud space, lavud zone from the top, that would also still have to be less than 3 tefachim. But if the 3 tefachim close to the top would have to be less than 1 tefach. But if there was 1 tefach of thickness within the 3 tefachim closest to the top of the this bed, well then asur, because you're going to be constructing an ohel of a tefach. And even if all these conditions so far are met, that the top of it's less than a tefach wide, and even the 3 tefachim closest to the top of it are also less than a tefach wide. Nonetheless, nami lo amarin ela she'ein b'shipua tefach. Now, still, its slope would have to be less than a tefach, right? Meaning the entire width of the bed from like the out. Let's say if you take like it's kind of like a V, right? So you have like the left slope and the right slope. So from the left slope to the middle and from the right slope to the middle, each has to be less than a tefach. So basically, you're talking about essentially. I think you can have basically the slope be less than a tefach, and then also like the middle part less than a tefach, and then the other slope less than a tefach. You're pretty much talking about a really thin bed. And Rashi asks the kasha, and he gives another interpretation of how you can maybe have like multiple of these cross-board things. Chevra, I don't know. If you have a bed like this, maybe raise the kasha in the WhatsApp group. We can have a nice little discussion, maybe pictures, and we can try to figure it out together. Hakoponim, well then the slope of the oil is like an oil itself, and if it's a tefach, it'll be a problem. Very nice. V'amar of Shisha Breder of Idi, says of Shisha Breder of Idi, Sayana, a black hat. Chevra, we had this sugya in Masechta Shabbos, the Borsalino sugya. Right, you see, the Charedi Cheva, they like to wear these black hats on Shabbos. I'm wearing a black hat, but it's a different kind of black hat. It's, the rim around it. So, Shari, so you're allowed to wear it on Shabbos. Ve'atanya, asur, we have a brayso that says you're not allowed to wear it on Shabbos. Lo kasha, no problem. Ha, de'iz be'tefach, ha deleiz be'tefach. Depends if the brim is a tefach wide or not. Ela me'ata shayviv beglime tefach hachi nami do asur. But 1 second. Let's say I take my talis and I extend it over past my head a tefach. I can't go out with it because it'll be constructing an ohel. So ela lo kasha ad mahadek ad lo mahadek. No, so rather scratch that. The black hat, as long as it is on your head tightly, so that and it won't fall off and you won't come to carry it, so then that's acceptable. But if it's loose, then you got to be careful. Chever, we get to a new Mishnah. Machzirin tzir atachton b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So if you have a teva, shida, umigdal, a carriage, a crate, or a closet, right, and it's got a door on it, and the door is fastened by 2 pivots, one at the bottom of it and one at the top of it. So you can return, right, if it falls off, you can put back in place tzira tachton, the lower pivot, b'mikdash, in the Beis HaMikdash, avalo b'Medina, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. I.e., it's also midrabanan and ain't shvus b'mikdash, so it's allowed in the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'elyon, but if it's the top pivot that you want to put in place, kan v'chan aser, would be forbidden, whether you're in the Beis HaMikdash, whether you're outside of the Beis HaMikdash. That would be also midoraisa because of bona. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda ha'elyon b'mikdash, no, the upper one you're allowed to use in the mikdash, but not outside, i.e. the upper one is also midrabanan, it's the shvus, v'atachton b'medina, but the lower pivot you can even put back into place outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Tzir deles shida teva umigdal, the pivot of the door of a cistern, no, a carriage, a crate, or a closet. B'mikdash machzirin. So in the Beis HaMikdash we said that you're allowed to put it back in place. B'medina dochakin. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you wouldn't be allowed to put it back in place, but if it only came out a little bit, you can kind of push it back in place. Ve'elyon, but the upper pivot, kan v'chan lo yachzir, you are unable to put it back no matter where you are, because it's also midoraisa. Gzeira shema yitaka. Now the reason why the lower pivot you are unable to put back in place, you're allowed to nudge it back in place, but you can't put it back in place outside of the Beis HaMikdash, is because of a gzeira shema yitaka. Maybe you're going to stick it in stark into the ground, and it'll be like bona v'imtaka chayiv chatas, and you'll be chayiv chatas for that. Shal bor v'shal dos v'shal yatzia. If you have a door leading into a pit, or a cistern, or an annex, lo yachzir v'mhichzir chayiv chatas. Do not put back even the lower one, and if you do, then you're going to be chayiv a korban chatas, because it's directly into the ground. Chevre, nu mishnah, machzirin ritia b'mikdash, avalo b'medina. So if you have a kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, and he's doing his avoda in the Beis HaMikdash, and he has a bandage, he hurt his hand. Now he's unable to do the avoda in the Beis HaMikdash with the bandage on his hand, as the pasuk says, v'lokach ha-kohen, that the kohen needs to take. I'm reading Rashi, v'cheven the chayetz lo avelikicha, and if he has a chatzitza between his hand and what he's taking, it would be a problem. So if he wants to do the avoda in the Beis HaMikdash, he has to remove the bandage from his hand. So in the Beis HaMikdash, a kohen would be allowed to remove the bandage from his hand and put it back on after the avoda. Avalo b'Medina, but outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you would be unable to remove and replace a bandage on Shabbos. I believe that this is Davka talking about a bandage that has like some kind of ointment on it. In batchila kan v'chan aser. Now, if we're talking about lichatchila, meaning you had a wound, there was no bandage on the wound, and now you want to apply a bandage to the wound, so you would be unable to do that whether you're in the Beis HaMikdash, whether you're not in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the Gemara discusses the case of what if you had a bandage and it fell off, meaning the Mishnah was talking about a bandage that you're removing or a bandage that you're putting on for the first time. What if you had a bandage but it just fell off on its own? Okay, says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, so if you have a bandage that was on a wound, okay, Machzirin also b'Shabbos, and it fell off, so you can put it back on the wound on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, Huchlika lemata dochka lemala. So Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. It says, no, if you have a bandage that was on a wound and it fell off, then you are unable to put it back on the wound on Shabbos. But if it, started slipping down a little bit below, so then dochka lemala, you can push it back up. Lemala dochka lemata. If it was, navigating, if it was gravitating northward, so then you can move it southward. You could reveal the part of the wound and then clean it. And then you could reveal the other part of the wound and clean it that way. Just do not remove the bandage entirely. But do not clean the bandage itself. You can clean the wound, but not the bandage, because that would be spreading the meireach chayiv chatas. And if you smooth something out on Shabbos, you're going to be chayiv a korban chatas. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, lachak Rav Yehuda. Says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that the lachas like Rav Yehuda that you may not replace a bandage that fell off on Shabbos. Okay. Amar Rav Chizda, lo shanu ela sheper shal gabe kli Says Rav Chizda that even when the Chachamim say that you would be allowed to replace a bandage that fell off, that is only if it fell onto another kli. But if it fell onto the floor, even the Chacham would say that you'd be unable to replace it. Amar Ma'abar Avashi said, I was before my father, Rav Ashi, Nafale Abesadya, and a bandage fell off onto a pillow. And he put it back onto the wound. So I said to my father, I said to Rav Ashi, Lo savela mar lahadam Rav Chizda, don't you hold of that which Rav Chizda said, machlokas shepersha agabe kli, that the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda is when the bandage falls onto a kli. Aval persha agabe karka, but if it falls onto the ground, asur, then everyone agrees that it would be forbidden. V'amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Yehuda, and Shmuel says that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, meaning Rav Ashi was asking his father, how come you're putting back the bandage on the wound? Right? It fell onto the pillow. And Rav Chizda says that the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda is when it falls on the pillow. And Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that you would be unable to put the bandage back. And Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, i.e., you're not allowed to put the bandage back. Omar Li, so my Rav Ashi says that my father Rav Ashi said to me, Lo Shmiya Li, I didn't hear this, klomar lo svirli, meaning I don't hold of it. That Rav Ashi disagrees, and he says that the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda is when the bandage fell onto the floor. But if the bandage fell onto a kli, everyone would agree, right? Meaning even Rabbi Yehuda would say that would be permitted, and therefore, since the bandage fell on a pillow, Rav Ashi felt that it was permitted to put the bandage back on his wound. Cheved, that was daf Kuf Beis, daf 102 of Masechta Ayruvin. Let us review. This was chock full of stuff. So we started off talking about bolts. When you have bolts in doors, can you use those bolts? So there are a number of distinctions to be made. So if it has a knob on it, well then it can be considered a kli, right? So, well, let's start off with this. If the bolt is attached to the door with a strong rope, that you can use the rope to lift up the bolt, so then you would be able to, so then everyone agrees that you'd be able to use this bolt on Shabbos, okay? Now, what if the bolt was not attached to the door with a very strong rope? So then we say, well, it depends. If it has a knob, i.e., if it could be considered a kli, so then Rabbi Yossi says that you would be able to use it nonetheless because it's a kli, whereas Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and says that you would be unable to use this bolt because we would not consider it to be a kli. If we just have a regular old bolt, well then the Tanakama says, well, if it's tied and it's dragging on the ground, so then you would be able to use it. It's also midrabanan. You'd be able to use this bolt in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. The Chachamim say that, Rabbi Yehuda says that this actually would be considered mutar everywhere, Beis HaMikdash and outside of the Beis HaMikdash. If it was just a free bolt, well then, the Chachamim said, the Tanakama says that it would be also midoraisa, so unusable even in the Beis HaMikdash, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says that this is where it would be allowed in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Fine. Then we talk about refastening doors. So if we're talking about like a carriage, a crate, or a closet, well then, if we're talking about the upper pivot of this door, well that would be, Tanakama would say it's asur, midoraisa. And Rabbi Yehuda says it would be also midrabanan. The nafka mina being, can you use it in the Beis HaMikdash or not? If we're talking about the lower pivot, so then the Chacham say it's also midrabanan, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's completely mutter. If we're talking about the door of a pit, a cistern, or an annex, well then it'll be a problem of the lower bolt. At least will be a problem of boneh. Applying bandages on Shabbos. So you are unable to apply a bandage milchatchila on Shabbos because we're concerned about smoothing things out. But in the Beis HaMikdash, if you have a Kohen who had to take off his bandage in order to, so the Chatchila, you're unable to put a bandage on Shabbos, even in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, if you have to remove it and put it back, so in the Beis HaMikdash, that would be permissible. So if you have a Kohen who had to remove his bandage in order to do the avoda, that would be permissible. He'd be able to put it back. Now, if it fell off on its own, so there's a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Chachamim say that you would be able to put it back. Rabbi Yehuda says you would be unable to put it back, and Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Now, Rav Chisda says that this machlokes is dafka when the bandage falls onto a kli, but if it fell onto the floor, even Chachamim would say it's aser. Whereas Rav Ashi argues and says no, the machlokes is when it fell on the floor, but if it fell on a kli, it would be completely permitted. Chevra, that was daf 102 of Masechta Ayruvin. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.